Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Customer and Corporate Services Scrutiny Management Committee. I'm Councillor Stephen Fenton, and I'm the Vice Chair. Councillor Crawshaw's unexpectedly called away, so he's not able to be here, so I'll step in and chair the meeting. So apologies for absence. So in addition to Councillor Crawshaw, whose apologies we'll note, Councillor Pearson sends his apologies and is substituted by Councillor Wan, and Councillor Musson sends her apologies and is substituted by Councillor Kilbane. So welcome, welcome both. First item is to ask members if they have any interests that they wish to declare. Nope. Okay, thank you. Agenda item 2. We're asked to approve the minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of March 2022. Do any members have any comments on the minutes, any matters of accuracy that they wish to raise? Nope. Okay, we're happy to approve those. Great, thank you. Agenda item 3 is public participation. We have 2 speakers joining us this evening, one here in person and one virtually. So if I can ask Johnny Hayes to join us at the table, please. Please. Good evening, Mr. Hayes. You have 3 minutes. You know the score. So cheers. Over to you.
I'm very keen to raise a number of fundamental concerns from this report that needs detailed scrutiny. The way that this and previous administrations have handled many major COYC developments in the city, I would describe as often predetermined and unresponsive to alternative approaches, but with an ability to move the goalposts. Transparency and accountability are vital for proper functioning of democratic governance. But reading this report and other interconnected reports, there are so many examples where smoke and mirrors seem to be used to get the development over the line, showing a reluctance to hear a different business case or an environmental concern or a heritage case or to listen to residents' interests. But my focus today is St George's Field multi-storey car park. There's been a petition and a campaign to ask that any decision is based on accurate data and evidence. The previous strategic access and parking review in the autumn 2021 provided hundreds of pages that were sprinkled with inaccurate data, subjective and questionable analysis, and focused on selling assets rather than what is best for the future of our city. The inaccurate data on the occupancy was even used at the St George's Field Planning Committee reports that I believe may well have affected the committee decision. The only reference I could find for a comprehensive car parking review was back in the Southern Gateway review in 2015 that concluded this is needed to improve, consolidate parking in the most appropriate areas in the city. But this was 7 years ago. Now, we were told in the autumn of 21 that the business case for the multi-storey car park would be decided by February 22. And according to reports, a presentation was provided to the executive in early February, which concluded the business case for the multi-storey car park. Soon after, the deputy leader of the council announced in the press that the multi-storey car park was dead in the water. Now, I've issued an FOI to receive this presentation, but have been refused. So I have referred this to the Information Commissioner, but this will take months. Scrutiny Committee, please receive this presentation and that I've had refused. Scrutiny Committee, please demand to see this presentation, as I suspect that if we see this report, then the smoke and mirrors will be revealed and we will get closer to the truth. Finally, the section on ethical disposal of city assets not being discussed openly seems outrageous. Surely subjects like this need to be completely out in the open. So I've written to key councillors to raise specific examples in the hope they raise them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes, and I'm sure your comments will be picked up later in the agenda when we come to talk about the capital programme update.
Yeah, I've got to whiz off.
That's quite right. If you can just turn your microphone off, that'd be great.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. So our second speaker this evening is joining us virtually, and that's Kate Revilius. Can you hear us, Kate?
I can, thank you. I'd like to start with a brief reminder of a motion passed by full council in 2019 to a healthier, greener York, which made a commitment to develop and implement a plan to restrict all non-essential private motor vehicle journeys within the city walls by 2023. Annex D of Agenda Item 4 summarises the Transport Capital Programme budget for the next year, but makes no mention of this motion anywhere. Where is the strategy and what are the measurable goals to show how the transport schemes will work together to restrict all non-essential private motor vehicle journeys within the city walls by 2023? Where are the measurements to confirm that the council is on track to fulfil its democratic responsibility? At the Executive Member for Transport Decision session last week, we learned that vehicle traffic travelling up through the heart of the city via Piccadilly and Stonebow has tripled in the space of 4 years, with over 5,000 vehicles per day using this route in 2021. This increase is clearly due to a complete failure to enforce traffic restrictions in this area, and yet the decision session made no commitment to start enforcing the restrictions. Instead, the new road layout for Piccadilly has been designed around an anticipated 5,000 or more vehicles each day, at least half of which are non-essential private motor vehicle journeys. How can the public have confidence the Transport Capital Programme budget will enable York to achieve the commitments specified in the Healthier Greener York motion made by next year? Worse still, designs like Piccadilly and Tadcaster Road, which fail to take active travel seriously, will fail to gain approval from Active Travel England and ultimately risk loss of funding from all government transport funding streams, resulting in transport misery for everyone, not just pedestrians and cyclists. What are highways officers doing to address this significant financial risk? Moving on, Castle Gateway interdependencies. Annex B of the Capital Programme Update provides a thin summary of the Castle Gateway project, vaguely hinting at complexities, but failing to make clear the links between different elements of the project or outlining the risks this entails. In February of this year, Neil Ferris, Corporate Director of Place, wrote a letter to a group of us who'd raised concerns about the project. He explained critical interdependencies, and I quote him as follows. Castle Mills has a planning condition attached, which means the apartments cannot be occupied until Castle Car Park closes. Castle Car Park cannot close until a replacement parking strategy has been implemented, and consequently Castle Mills cannot proceed until a replacement parking strategy has been approved. I have 2 questions which I'd really like answers to. Number 1, is it true that Castle Car Park cannot close until a replacement parking strategy has been implemented? If so, when was this agreement made and how binding is it? Number 2, any interdependencies within this project present a key risk. If one part of the Castle Gateway scheme is delayed or failed, it could jeopardise the entire scheme. Why are the risks associated with the interdependencies not clearly identified and assessed as part of this capital programme update? The Castle Gateway project is being funded using public money and developed on council land. The public deserve complete transparency as to what the risks associated with this project are and how those risks are being managed. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, Ms. Revilius, and I'm sure those points will come up in the discussion we're about to have at Agenda Item 4. So, Agenda Item 4, Capital Programme Update. Can I invite officers to join us at the table? So just to recap, this committee requested a review of the Place Capital Programme, and this report responds to that request. Members will see there are a number of annexes that provide some of the detail on the projects within within the Place Directorate, and the report identifies specific areas where scrutiny could add value in the future. So we're joined by Tracy Carter, Director, Economy, Regeneration and Housing, James Gilchrist, Director of Planning and Transport and something else that I've forgotten. Environment, of course, and Neil Ferris, Corporate Director for Place. So who would like to kick off? Neil.
I'll do an overview and then you can hand over to yourself. So
if you can smooth the microphone a bit nearer.
I'll do a quick introduction and then we can effectively start to explore the individual projects as you see fit. So Corporate Scrutiny asked for a overview of the capital programme from the Directorate of Place. What we've provided for the Corporate Scrutiny tonight is an overview of how major projects are managed throughout the organisation at the direction of members in terms of that oversight arrangements, the boards that exist at an officer level, the need for all significant decisions on every capital programme to come to executive for decision making, and that we regularly report to members through a number of and the public in a number of ways. So in terms of the annexes to tonight's report, you've got the Verto report, which is our major programmes reporting mechanism that's updated by project managers on a regular basis and is a public document. The quarterly performance report to executive also has a capital programme update within that. That clearly incorporates the whole council capital programme, but encompasses the place-based capital programme as well. And then because the local transport plan capital programme entails such a significant number of relatively small capital programmes, but which are very, very important to communities, those are reported to the executive member for transport, again on a quarterly basis, and we undertake environments within the local traffic transport plan capital programme within that reporting regime, again because clearly we over program in terms of the sheer scale of the number of activities that we're taking in 1 year. If there's a delay in one programme, you don't want to just wait there while it finishes. You start to move those about and bring other programmes forward, and we report that on a quarterly basis to the executive member for transport. So the public and the executive member for transport and yourselves can have an overview of what's happening in that more detailed, granular space of capital expenditure, but which has such significant impact on communities directly in terms of the transport programme. And we've laid out that report, the details from the Verto report as to the main essence of each of the programme. I would highlight for you tonight that they are, as has been made, the point being made clear by the speakers, it is a thin piece. It's not a detailed scrutiny of any individual project, but clearly if you wish to delve further into an individual project, we can respond tonight as to how we might best facilitate that and when might be best to facilitate that, because the issue with the capital programme is you go through a series of phases and circumstances. So you can be in a particular circumstance where you're in a commercially sensitive negotiation, in which case a scrutiny would be a very dry affair because we would be bound to fulfil well, most of it would end up being taking place in private, whereas very short few weeks later, we might be in a position to have a more open and transparent scrutiny with members about the subject area that we've been negotiating on, or that particular project. So I think in terms of that deep dive into individual projects, discussion with the relevant director is a key part of making sure we get the most out of scrutiny and that we're held to account by yourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. Shall we throw it open to questions, and then Tracy and James can come in if so questions on the detail of any of the particular projects. Okay, thank you for that. Members, Councillor Kilbane.
Thank you, Chair. Just in terms of the overview that you've given us, and thank you very much for the report. On page 7, bullet point 18, a number of major projects are likely to be added in the near future. Can you tell us what those projects are and when they're likely to be added?
I think the two obvious examples are the bus service improvement plan funding, which has been announced and we're in negotiation with DFT about, so that will be a big chunk of money coming in, as will the Zebra funding to electrify the bus fleet. So those are both two pots of money that will be dropping into the capital programme in the near future, which will obviously be a sort of a good example of that. I know Tracy has some as well.
Yeah, main one I think that will be forthcoming is if we were lucky enough to be successful in securing levelling up funding, that would be a further large-scale capital bid. But at the moment, we are bringing forward a report to June's executive to agree the content of those bids, and the determination of them won't be until the autumn. We have a number of large-scale programmes where individual decisions to expand the capital programme come before executive and full council. But at the moment, that's what you see now is our current version of all of the major projects.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Chair. So this is a broad suggestion of something for future scrutiny. If you can comment on its suitability and, as you said, Neil, when might be a good time. I'd request that we could assess the carbon impact of the outer ring road. Not only obviously the embedded carbon from the construction of the different parts of that project, but obviously all the carbon impact of the extra traffic that you anticipate, including the extra traffic from all the new housing in that area, and how that compares with the mitigated reduced traffic through the city centre. And you could perhaps base it on a similar road enlargement scheme from somewhere else in the UK.
There is, so just on the York Outer Ring Road project, that project is heading towards a planning application the next 3-4 weeks. I think that will probably be submitted. Part of the environmental impact assessment for that project does include a carbon assessment. So as that goes live at that point, that would be the point at which you could look at it. Whether it's appropriate to scrutinise that during the planning process is debatable, I would think.
All of that in terms of the carbon measurement, there's all different variations on how detailed you get to in carbon measurement. And I think it'd be a question, maybe that's something that climate change scrutiny wants to look at, as to how much, what's sufficient detail to assist decision making, and what is actually, are you getting diminishing levels of returns because your accuracy disappears as you go down into the detail. And what we're doing in respect to the outer ring road is the West Yorkshire Combined Authority and the DFT have looked at what is an appropriate level of detail for strategic capital projects, and we're reflecting that ambition of starting to report carbon in a meaningful way. But I would just like to manage expectations. It's not a detailed carbon balance sheet, because you are literally then talking about a significant amount of expenditure to try to get down to that level of detail. But it isn't without its cost, but we are doing that because that's part of the funding requirements.
So just picking up on that, so I suppose we could wait to see what information is included in the planning application, and I suppose that would be a kind of a starting point, and members could then, separate from the planning process, maybe have a think about whether that provides a starting point for sort of further discussions at climate change scrutiny. I don't know.
I think, I mean, there's the planning decision, and we all reflect the separate and independent nature of the planning decision, but there will be a subsequent decision, and James's team is going out for the procurement of the cost to build that, and there'll be a separate decision for executive. Do you want to build it? And scrutiny and pre-scrutiny might be of, well, one aspect of that pre-scrutiny decision might be, well, what are the climate change impacts, and what's the overall narrative, and how do you balance the need for a city to grow against climate change ambition? And Outer Ring Road is probably a really pertinent example of, it's a piece of infrastructure that transport modelers have basically said, you don't get your local plan delivered without the Outer Ring Road, because effectively from a transport perspective, you can't meet the requirements of the road network, which then means we effectively get into a position of having a local plan not delivered, which then gets you into the position of the Secretary of State intervening on the local plan to deliver the housing numbers, which then requires the delivery of infrastructure, and it starts to really fundamentally eke out the function of local governance and how do you reflect and mould the shape and the growth of the city. It's probably an interesting area for you to understand in more depth as to the close interrelationship between climate change, economy, and transport.
And just to follow up, presumably some of that will come out through the consultation on the strategies that I understand is happening concurrently at some point in the not too distant future.
The broad principle, the outer ring road is but one decision. The city will be faced with a plethora of decisions as you go forward through the strategy period that have to balance those priorities.
Okay. Councillor Corbett, yeah.
Just supplementary on that, Chair, because we moved a long way from sort of carbon measurement to sort of apocalyptic economic forecasts. Just to get back to the carbon measurement bit, the way that you're going to measure the carbon impact of the York Outer Ring Road, does it include the embedded carbon in the construction of it?
The honest answer is I can't remember the detail behind what is exactly in that that carbon assessment. But as I say, I'm more than happy to answer questions on it when it's available to the public. It's still in draft form, as I say. We're still 4 weeks out from submission to planning at this stage.
Thank you. Can I ask a question? I suppose it cuts across a lot of the updates in the report. Cost and resource regularly come up as risk factors in terms of cost inflation and difficulty securing resource in terms of labour. It would be interesting to get your perspective as to whether you, the extent to which those challenges you think will remain manageable, or what kind of worst case scenario modelling have you done in terms of where we're heading on that front? In the sense, none of us really know whether inflation will continue on its current trajectory.
I'll thank Councillor Kilbane for sort of the reference to the Bank of England and apocalyptic economic. I will once more go there and say we reflect that the situation is going to get worse. But I'll leave James and Tracy to tell you about the challenges that we're facing on the ground. But I do. This is a constant message I'm trying to get over to all members and to the members of the public. The sheer scale of what we can do with our revenue account and our capital account is reducing daily.
Yeah, I think from just about every procurement that we've seen coming to fruition over the last 6 to 12 months, the extent of construction inflation on that far outstrips the Bank of England predictions about general inflation levels. Some, I think, useful advice that we've got from our professional cost consultancy advisors, T&T, shows upwards of 20% and higher on some commodities. The kind of unseen bit of that is not just about the availability of materials or the cost of materials, it's the availability of resources and the capacity within the sector for them to respond to tenders and provide accurate costs that can be relied upon. And I think that's a growing risk that we're seeing, that's perhaps that we've not had before. You've been able to go out to tender, get a cost and pretty much rely on it because your contract kind of baked that in. Now what we're getting is an extreme reluctance from contractors to offer fixed price contracts because their subcontractors are not offering the same to them, and it's changing on a kind of daily, weekly basis. So we're getting quite a bit of pushback. I think it's a significant and growing risk. Our response to it will need to be on a project by project basis. There may be somewhere the business case for it shifts alongside it. So a recent report that we took to executive on the housing delivery programme, some of the impacts of construction inflation were offset by house price growth, and the natural inbuilt subsidy model that we were working on there still made the project deliverable. There may be other projects where the inflationary aspect exceeds the revenue budgets or the capital budgets that we put to one side, and we need to bring it back to executive and to full council to reconsider the business case for that. One of the ones that we're particularly seeing that is a procurement that's not yet concluded, so I can't comment in too much detail, but the inflationary impact has taken it over the amount of grant that we've actually got, and therefore that balance between the things that you promised to deliver for your grant in terms of the volume of change that you were generating and the amount of money it's going to cost you to deliver that are in danger of being out of kilter. Therefore, we may have to go back to the funder, we may have to come back to executive, but I think there's no kind of generic risk profile on that. It really does depend on what you're doing, because certain commodities, certain skill sets are more subject to this kind of inflationary escalation than others.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think obviously delay now has a significant cost where it previously didn't cost us in the same way. So the cost of delay to projects not only can drive up cost, but if your delay is at the wrong time, you can lose the price that you were holding on to. So if contractors, 2 years ago were prepared to give you a price and hold it for 6 months, now they're measuring it in sort of days, hours. Yeah, it's so the need to refine our project management to be more agile to respond to those market inflations is very real. And just coming back to the sort of resource question, it's the challenges are often not just around labour, for instance, as you alluded to, but also about key specialisms. So the active travel programme, which has been a national push, partly through a DfT sort of emerging policy, partly through responses to COVID, has meant that every council in the country is looking for the same skill sets and to grow its resource in that area. So you get sudden peaks of demand when you get sudden policy changes as well, and that creates its own challenge in terms of delivery for authorities as well.
Thanks for that.
Further
question?
One refinement on that.
Yeah.
Some of the policy initiatives that have generated funding streams that have come into place since COVID have also, I think, been impacted by the fact that during COVID, that supply side, the development of those industries was not happening at the rate it would normally would. So particularly, for instance, on retrofit, where we've been successful in getting about £5 million of grant funding for a range of energy efficiency measures on council housing, on private rented, on private housing. That was already a supply chain which was in its infancy. Over the last 2 years, everybody's ambitions for it have increased, but actually the amount of resource available nationally and the supply chain for it has not increased to meet that, and therefore you get that over in the same way that James has described. You get everybody wanting the same thing at the same time, and no surprises there. It's not actually possible, and it pushes cost up even further.
So just on that, because where we're in a situation such as that, and we have been allocated funding that has to be spent by a certain date, is there any indication of funders being any more flexible in terms of recognising the challenges that authorities face in actually spending the money that have been awarded, or is it a case of if you haven't spent it or committed it by this date, then you have to give it back?
Depends on the funding stream as to how much flexibility there is.
Yeah.
Tends to be absolutely no flexibility until they realise it's not going to be spent, and then sometimes flexibility can be built in, but they continue to put out new funding sort streams with a similar short time scale. So one would suggest that they're perhaps not learning lessons from that, although the point has been made over and over again to a number of departments that this is not the best way of getting the outcomes from the funding.
A good example of that would be the active travel funding, which initially came with a block of money, get on and deliver, and then evolved into actually we needed to consult and make sure these things work. And actually, so the timelines have been relaxed quite significantly by BFT around active travel funding, for instance. Initially, it was very tight. It was originally labelled emergency funding, and now they've actually relaxed all those timetables, understanding that actually what you're trying to do is make significant change, and you need to do that in the right way.
Thank you. Councillor Kilburn.
Yeah, just on the same issue.
Yep, Mike.
Okay, yeah, just on the same issue in the report on page 22, any procurement process or identifies a cost higher than budget would be reported to members. Do you mean all members or exec members, or what are we looking at something that's so serious we're going to have regular updates to all members on sort of inflationary pressures?
It would be reported to executive in public to say, actually, this is no longer affordable. There's a choice to be made.
Just combination of the 2 points there, really, in terms of the funding at a national level. So what we're looking at for a lot of our capital programme is nationally funded projects, and the interesting thing about the carry forward piece that that James has described with the active travel piece, that a lot of it comes down to the Treasury and the political will behind it. So if you actually want to see at a national level a programme delivered, then we get an awful lot of flexibility given us at a local authority level. If a national policy is seen to be actually past its sell-by date politically, so we saw in terms of the Green Deal, that was the private sector piece that was announced in the August, I think, just prior to COVID, withdrawn the following April, and that was something like £2 billion. It was a huge amount of money that was a programme and then disappeared and not a programme, and so it's just the context of our local situation is reflected by the national decision making, and you see a lot more flexibility where there's actually political traction at a national level to see things delivered, and actually if it takes another 6 months, another year, another 2 years, then that flexibility is given us, but it generally is as long as progress has been given. But if you see a national policy where they're just getting no traction at all, or politically it falls out of favour, then that's when the real risk of it being withdrawn manifests itself in our decision making. But in the circumstances that Tracy's described, where we've made an admission for external funding, we've gone through a procurement exercise and can't fulfil it, then our first port of call is to go back to the funders, whichever department it is, and ask them, what's your view of it? We won't abandon it at that stage. We will then go back to executive and say, this is the funder's view, this is the cost, what would you like to do? Would you like to proceed? Would you like to proceed based on what, on the combination of local appetite to fund the gap, national appetite to give leeway or increase funding? And that's the way it would work. Members would drive those decisions.
Well, questions or observations from members? Councillor Orrell?
Not particularly on that point. We've seen it before many times over the years. Similar things have happened. But I was going to ask about the planning application for the Outer Ring Road, but you've answered that, James. The Hyperhub at Monks Cross, when will it open?
We are very close. So the Northern Power Grid provided the electricity 2 weeks ago, I think, to the site, which has been the stalling point, getting all the necessary permissions in place to get the power to the site. So we're in commissioning now. So the solar array and the batteries are working. All of the chargers, bar one, at each of the Hyperhub sites are now working. So we've just got the final fixes to do on those last two chargers, and then it will be turned on. So literally within, a few days, week, I hope we'll be able to announce that it is available. No, I think the important thing to say is it's obviously been a significant project for the city, but it is about the additional benefit of those chargers. It's not been, that's on top of the improvements we made to the chargers in the city centre. So as you remember, there was a programme a year ago, 18 months ago, to improve all those chargers in the city centre. So it's going to be a significant increase in provision when they do go live.
Councillor Kilbane.
Just on the hyperhub, so it'll be coming in around about 10 months late. I think it's supposed to be July last year. And can you tell us how much it's going to rely on fossil fuel burning for the electricity? My
understanding is the council doesn't buy any, it pays a premium to make sure it doesn't buy any fossil fuel generated electricity.
Councillor Norman.
Just a supplementary on that, for a technical point, although we pay a premium for that energy, it is national grid energy, so it is fossil fuel powered electricity. It's just that we're subsidising additional. Yeah, just for clarity.
I was exactly the point I was going to make, Councillor Norman. There's a nuance there, but I do think Councillor Kilbane is very right in terms of pointing out the delay, and it's a delay that was, none of us would want to have seen. But I think there is an area there potentially Scrutiny might want to look at in the upcoming programme, which is the responsiveness of the utility companies to local authorities and also major projects. I know it's something that's considered regularly nationally, but the actual impact is quite staggering as to the standing on ceremony around things like way leaves, etc., and the hurdles that you have to jump through with our statutory service providers. It's all cash up front, it's all subject to revision of costs, no risk taken whatsoever. And what we're seeing on, particularly in terms of climate change ambition, and we were at developers just this Friday, and any upgrade on that site, entirely the developer's responsibility to upgrade the electricity network that wasn't fit for purpose to deliver low carbon solutions and or EV charging going forward. So it's just a really hot topic, really, in terms of responsiveness and capacity. And Sean Gibbons is leading on the council's work with North Yorkshire on the LEAP, so that's the local area energy plan, and that again sits into that piece of interfacing with the statutory services about what does future capacity look like for the city. So a really interesting strategic topic for a Scrutiny to have a look at as to the future aspirations of the city. Just to
yeah, I suppose it's one of those, one of the public speakers mentioned earlier, sort of interdependencies, where it's one of those those areas where there is a dependency, and I suppose it would be interesting to look at what levers we do have at our disposal to influence others whose cooperation we need, but don't always necessarily get in the way that we would wish. But Councillor Norman.
Yeah, I think it is a big issue. I had an issue in my wards with one of our larger landowners having issues with being unambitious, I think we'll put it that way, with their energy supplying that came to planning a while back. I just guess it strikes me as if that sort of thing, by the sounds of it, is fairly predictable at the moment. Do we factor that in? Was the Monks Cross development, was the potential issues with energy suppliers and liaison factored in as a risk, both financially in regards to time and everything?
Yes, it was. So we actually worked through a third-party specialist to try and resolve, anticipated that this, obviously for a site requiring, although we generate a lot of electricity on site, we obviously require a grid connection to flow both ways. So yes, it was, and we appointed specialists as part of the project team to support us on that. But as I say, it has been a hurdle in the project, but yes, we did anticipate it. It was in the risk register, still is in the risk register, and we did have an action plan to try and mitigate it, but obviously not as effectively as we had hoped.
Thank you. Councillor Kilbane.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I don't want to hog proceedings. I do have quite a lot of questions, but if anybody else wants to come in, please, I'm happy to sit back. Just, you mentioned the public speakers there, Chair, and they raised a number of questions around the whole Castle Gateway project. And it'd be good if we could answer some of those questions. So they asked if there was an agreement that the Castle car park wouldn't be closed until alternative parking was found. If that's the case, who was that agreement made between? And so what force does it have? Can you let us know, or I believe there's been a presentation made to exec, which led the executive member for transport to say that the St George's Field multi-storey car park is dead in the water. I think was the phrase that they used. One of the public speakers asked if that presentation can be shared. Is that possible for you to share it? And can you comment on whether or not that comment by the executive member was accurate? And can you let us know what's going on with the Castle Mills Flats development, where we're up to with them?
A very brief answer to all of those things is that there will be a report to executive in June, which will set out the existing position with the Castle Mills apartment block construction, and will also look at the links between that and the other decisions about proceeding with the parking replacement and the vacation of the car park. So the connectivity issues is that there is a planning condition on occupation of the Castle Mills flats, which must see the Castle car park closed before it opens, because that's an enabling development to see the development of the public realm on the Castle car park site. There is a commitment from the executive as part of its initial decision making on this scheme to facilitate replacement parking before the Castle car park closes. But that case all needs to be reconsidered in the round with all of those interrelationships in the executive report, which will come to executive in June. Question about briefings given in private to the executive as the development of the scheme goes forwards is one of strategy development, and it's consistent FOI response. If something is going to be published and it is a work in progress, that we don't release the FOI on that until such point as those considerations have been made. So all of the information about the business case for replacement parking will be featured in a future public executive report. Was there one I've missed out of those?
The flats, I think you covered that.
Yeah, the Castle Mills apartmented scheme will be the focus of the June report, and I'm not able to say anything more because of commercial confidentiality issues in the run up to that report.
So the executive is on the 16th of June, so the report published 8th, thereabouts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Neil, do you want to add anything then, Councillor Bain?
Just to add to that, so just in terms of the position that the trade is outlined there, which is absolutely correct, is that just for clarity, these decisions are made by members and can be varied by members. I'm not suggesting you will, but the condition of not not allowing occupation of Castle Mills subject to a planning condition is within members' gift to change planning conditions. The executive's commitment not to close Castle car park without opening another car park. Again, these are not statutory constraints. These are constraints the council's determined at a point in time to put on itself. You executive council has the opportunity as the facts change to change your view. So it's just reflecting that you are in control of all of these things. And in terms of the statement made by the deputy leader, that was a matter for the deputy leader to make those statements. It wasn't a statement of the executive. And clearly, just to differentiate ourselves, our role is to effectively fulfil the resolutions as passed by members who are sitting in their formal positions when they make those decisions, either as executive member, leader, or full council, and that's when we enact things, not when those things are taken outside of those formal duties.
Thank you. Did you want to come back on any of that, Councillor Kilbane?
Sounds to me like the deputy leaders speaking with some accuracy by the sounds of that. In terms of the information that public speakers were after, is that information going to be present at the for the exec in June? Is that what you're saying? That information that they've been provided with?
I'm just trying to think of exactly what they asked for, but yeah, there will be a comprehensive report on current progress, the interrelationships, and the progress of any decision making on all three aspects of that.
I think it was a business case that led to the deputy leader to alter his opinion that the car park was dead in the water. Is that going to be presented to the exec?
The current position with the business case will be presented. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for that. And obviously that I'm sure is something that members will take a keen interest in when that's published and have the opportunity to speak at executive. Okay. Obviously, audit and governance undertake a regular review of governance surrounding the major projects. The report talks about areas of either existing or future projects that Scrutiny may want to look at, not from a project governance perspective, but from a policy development perspective. And paragraph 18 on page 7 refers to bus service improvement funding and Zebra, which is the electric bus funding, which on the face of it seem exactly the kind of developments that Scrutiny should be taking interest in and being residents' voices in terms of as plans are developed in detail to deliver those schemes. Obviously that, to my mind, sits with economy in place as the most logical place for that to sit. Can you just maybe, James, set out a bit more about the sort of the choreography of we've been given an indicative allocation from government, but what the step in brief, the steps that need to be undertaken before it starts to become a reality?
Yes, it's the first time my name has been used in conjunction with choreography, but yes, so we are in negotiation in effect with BSIP, with DFT, sorry. They've given us an initial allocation for our bus service improvement plan. We have to work with them over the summer, basically, to finalise the details of what that plan will be. There's probably a decision point round about August time where I think some scrutiny would be helpful to look at that. But we can keep that under review. If there are decision points coming up, obviously we can talk to you about whether there's a point before that. But I hope we will get some confirmation of the funding allocation finalised by the autumn. And a similar timescale for Zebra is my understanding.
Another meetings coming up in June for each committee to meet with senior officers and executive members to do a bit of a forward look in terms of items that Scrutiny can look at from a sort of policy development perspective, as well as a sort of looking back at what we've done. So that certainly is one that I would want economy in place to consider. Yeah,
I mean, we've obviously made a submission now to Department for Transport, so that's something that could be looked at now in terms of what the submission is now. So it could arguably come in advance of any final decisions. So you could choose to do it now based on what the sort of latest version of our bid, I suppose you'd call it, or you can wait for Department for Transport to go, here it is. So yeah, there are options there that we can talk to when we meet with that committee.
Yeah, obviously I don't want to derail other things that economy in place are wanting to look at in the short term, but certainly if that can be added to the mix, and if it's particularly pertinent for it to be looked at now in advance of the details of it being nailed down, then that would seem helpful. Okay, Neil.
And just to reflect on an area that Tracy and I noticed before the meeting, which just reminded myself of it, under the Guildhall resources, under the budget, it's currently showing green, it should be amber. We haven't completed the financial close of the Guildhall contract, so it shouldn't be green until we've got financial close, and that will be reported in the June one report for the executive as to the outturn. If that all been well, we're hoping to be able to do it by then. It may be a final outturn is later on in the year, but there'll be an initial outturn in that report in June. As reported last autumn, project has overspent relative to original budget, and further budget allocation has been made to the project. But clearly, as can be seen in the Verto report, a significant number of risks associated with the project that manifested themselves. So again, it's worthwhile just reflecting on that conversation we had earlier about were risks foreseen. Risks are often foreseen, but when they manifest themselves, the extent that they bite the budget is always a subject of an unknown, because they're effectively risks that you recognise that you can't necessarily control. So when they actually do materialise, the costs can effectively wind their way through a project depending on when they hit and what the scale of the risk that you've hit. But it's about then proactively how you manage that risk when it manifests itself. But that'll be a subject of that quarter 3 outturn when we finally close that contract.
Okay.
But you'll all see it on Thursday in terms of the actual physical results on the ground.
Indeed. Thank you. Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. Really just picking up on Neil's point there, and then Tracy made a point earlier. I mean, material costs are rising far more than any inflationary or predicted rises. And when we're funding big projects, clearly the material cost, the impacts of those rises on material costs, and you've alluded to it there, Neil, you can't second guess those. So my question would be, and more than happy for you to bring it back to another scrutiny meeting, was of the projects that we've currently got that are in approval and that we're looking to complete, are any of them in danger of having to be either postponed or amended at this stage?
We'd like to have a go at that.
I would say that everything that isn't in contract is at risk of having to come back and either be reconsidered or postponed, because if it's not in contract, we've not got an agreed price. So I think that's a fair piece, and there's an awful lot of the capital programme that is subject to those final decisions. As to the scale, it will depend on most of the contracts. So, for example, the Guildhall, which is nearly complete, the risk is passed. There are certain contracts, and Jason will talk about some of the ones that we've got on the housing delivery programme, James, some of the transport ones, where we're in contract and we've got prices to deliver those contracts, subject to variations, but generally materials pricing is covered in those contracts. It's the unknown risks that come left of the field that I was talking about predominantly, but absolutely contracts where we're not currently into contract, we are finding that and this is really unusual, certainly in the last 20 years, it's not a case that I think we've had to face as a public sector body, because we come as a blue chip client and therefore people are very reassured that they're going to get paid. We're starting to get to the situation where on particular materials, contractors are saying, well, that's a client risk. So for example, steel price, they might give you an indicative price in a project to say that's the price of the steel now, but actually you'll pay actual costs for steel when we need to order it within the project, because it might be halfway through the project before you actually place the steel order. You can do it the other way around, and you can turn it, you say to the contractor, well, then that's not acceptable. We want 100% guarantee of the price. And you've got somebody then in a room sticking its finger in the air going, oh, it's 30% inflation, and you'll pay 30% no matter what, whether it is or it isn't. So under those circumstances, that pass back of risk is more likely to be seen in those procurements going forward. which we will have to highlight to members, because I think we're heading into some really unusual risk profiles going into contract.
Supplementary?
It is, Chair, yeah. And again, Tracy alluded at the beginning to the levelling up funding, and we don't know what that's going to be or how it's going to be divvied up, or what we can allot it to. But clearly, obviously, any levelling up funding that we are successful in bringing in, and I guess this is an assumption which please by all means, quash my assumption, is that any levelling up funding that we get in will in itself be affected by the overinflationary cost of materials, and how much of that levelling up funding would we need to use to shore up projects that have come in over budget. I'm just kind of curious as to how we're going to use it. Thank you, Tracy.
So levelling up funding is specific to the proposal that you put forward. So we need to be careful that we don't under-egg it, and that we provide significant contingency in our expected costs. Often projects like that are fairly speculative on what the cost base might be, because you're going at it from a fairly early stage in the development process. So you've not done detailed design, and therefore you don't have fixed costs. So we need to be really careful about the optimism bias. I always think that's a bit of a misnomer. It's the pessimism bias, if ever there was one, that we factor into those things. But levelling up funding will not be usable for supplementing budgets for schemes we've already committed.
Supplementary?
Yeah, just on that, and particularly talking about the cost of steel. Are we in contract for the hostile vehicle mitigation measures? Do we have that?
No, we are about to go out to procurement in the next week or two for hostile vehicle mitigation measures.
So again, the cost of those may be more than what was predicted.
Yeah. So as I alluded to before, the art increasingly is making sure you time your procurement at the right time. If you go too early and your information isn't sufficient and you have to revisit it, then you get covered for the price increase. So getting the timing right is important. So making sure we've got everything lined up for that. But yes, there is a risk of price increase on what we were anticipating a year ago when we put the budget together. So I would expect procurement to take 6 weeks, and we're probably looking at a July decision point about whether to go into contract for that or not.
Yeah.
So the staffed barrier on Goodrum Gate, that's likely to be still staffed beyond September. I think that it's in the budget for at the moment. That likely to go on further than that?
The September date is linked to the cafe licensing legislation. So the cafe licensing emergency legislation runs out in September. So those cafe licenses issued under emergency legislation run out in September. Tucked away at page 370 odd of the levelling up white paper is the changes to that legislation to make it permanent. So at the moment, we're just digesting that to understand what those impacts will be. So there's some decisions to be made, absolutely, about what happens after September. But it depends a bit on whether that legislation has been rolled on a bit, or whether that white paper has been through all its various bits of process.
Yeah.
And just so that you're aware, the current sort of barrier that we have on Goodrum Gate is absolutely pointless for stopping hostile vehicles, because you will be aware that currently vehicles can drive straight up Collier Gate and actually to the other side of the barrier on Goodrum Gate if they chose, or into town and all over Parliament Street or wherever they wanted. So unless, of course, we're relying on terrorists obeying the highway code and not going the wrong way up a one-way street, there's absolutely nothing to protect the city centre at the moment. So I guess those barriers are there just to stop law-abiding people from entering the city centre.
They're primarily there to protect the pavement cafes. They're not a HVM rated measure. They are there to protect the pavement cafes that are there at the moment from legitimate highway users, to reinforce that point that vehicles shouldn't be in there, because we have temporarily changed the rules for that bit of highway.
Thank you. Councillor Norman.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask briefly about the Station Gateway project, and particularly about the parking strategy there, which on page 48, that there's a section about that being under review for alternative parking scenarios going forwards. It seems to me, from a policy perspective, trying to keep on point on that, that's clearly where people are going to be parking long term at the station is an essential thing, and a really crucial thing from a policy perspective about how we move around the city. If we are going to be significantly changing how we go about parking, presumably we'll be consulting or at least having a formal decision at some point. When might we be having that kind of decision as a council? I understand there'll obviously be other partners involved, but obviously we have a significant amount of influence there that would be good to be exercised.
Who wants to have a go at that, James?
So I think it's important to understand the rationale. So at the moment, the way the station frontage project works is that we need some land off Network Rail to provide the improved bus interchange, the cycle route, the active travel elements. Part of the deal that was done, or the agreement, should I say, with Network Rail, and executive approved, was the principle that we would receive that land and Network Rail would build a multi-storey car park with no more parking than is there on site at the moment. So they would, and that's basically the rail industry saying, we want the level of parking we've got now going forward. And that's their starting point for giving us any land. We want the parking we've got. If we can do that, we'll give you the land for the public transport and active travel measures that you want to implement. Since we, and that went to exec, and that's what the existing planning permission is based upon. At the moment, Network Rail are saying the business case for the multi-storey doesn't stack up in terms of financial terms, but they're revisiting that. And but they still maintain the principle that they want the amount of parking that they've got now going forward. So at the moment, we are in a conundrum looking at other solutions for how we might meet that parking that they want to retain and deliver the active travel elements. So we are mid-negotiation in that process, I think it's fair to say. We are back and forth with Network Rail and LNER colleagues, and probably just about on the point of talking to DFT about it, to go, is this really, as all agents of DFT, is this, are we all in the right place on this? And I think that's probably where we're at. I don't really want to add anything there.
I think that's a fair description of where we are, and in terms of executive scrutiny of that, CSMC EMP scrutiny of that, we're thinking sort of September, October will be the sort of decision point for executive on the front of station. So we believe we've got a clarified position from Network Rail DFT. By that point, I can't say what that will be, but clearly we can present the positions or represent the positions to executive at that point, and then executive can make choices they see fit. Just want to come back, if I may, just on one point in respect of the hostile vehicle mitigation measures. The police and the anti-terrorism teams across the city are very aware that we don't have the permanent measures in place, so there is suitable alternative anti-terrorism measures being supplied to the city by the police in terms of their additional vigilance and response, so that they can respond to any terrorism incident in the city. I wouldn't want the YouTube watchers at home to think that there isn't a recognition that HVM measures aren't in place, and that the police are not aware that they need to make provision to deal with incidents should they occur in the city. So just make that clear to the world at large.
James, you want to
just coming back to station frontage, I think the important thing, just to reiterate, is that the project was always going to be delivered in phases, and that car parking element is actually about a later phase. So there will be phases delivered before that, but to reach the the complete vision of the 4 phases that were presented to exec last year, that car parking problem needs resolving. It doesn't mean the whole scheme is on hold. It just means we will get to a point where the project would have to pause at a phase if that hasn't been resolved.
Councillor Rowley.
Thanks, Chair. It is a supplementary, and it's coming back to your explanation a moment ago about contracts. Once contracts are awarded, the projects, it's future contracts that could potentially endanger a project. And stages frontage is one of those that you know, as you mentioned there, James, it's going to be in stages. So if a contract has been awarded for a particular stage, and then for whatever reason it's either delayed or it's cancelled, whatever decision executive make because of cost, what happens to those stages that have already been completed? And again, forgive me, I don't have the same kind of professional understanding as that you do, and it may well be that the stages that have been completed have no bearing on, whether, so I'm just curious.
So certainly for station frontage, it's been designed as a series of phases that at any point could stop.
Right.
So obviously, in very basic terms, demolition of Prince Street Bridge is a massive piece of enabling works, and obviously the first stage. There are then future stages which move it on, but actually even just doing that, those first few stages of getting the bridge demolished and putting in the bus stops and improving that front of station public realm would be a massive achievement. And I suspect the future regenerations would be easier to deliver once that bridge and space has been created. So when we talk about phases, they're designed at a point where you can say, we're drawing a line under phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3. They're not interdependent that you must see it all the way through to phase 4. Obviously, the maximum objectives and maximum outcomes are achieved by getting to that end point, but they are designed in a way that you can go, actually, we can pause. And the funding tends to work that we'll get the whole cost for all 4 phases, but the contractor may only hold, you can't necessarily hold them if you postpone the decision on future phases for too long, as we've talked about in terms of time.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Supplementary. So demolishing a bridge, if that's a stage in a phase in itself, but then you don't continue with the project, and a bridge has been demolished. What?
So the first phase is to demolish the bridge, put the road back, and put the realign the front of station edge. That's all one package. We can deliver that. It doesn't achieve all the vision by any stretch of imagination, but it wouldn't leave the city with the holes that traffic couldn't flow. So that would be completed. As I say, other objectives may not be achieved, parcel square, etc. Those sorts of things might not necessarily be achieved, but it would still be a functioning scheme and an improvement on what we've got now.
One last final question, Chair, if I might. It is a supplementary, and for all those members of the York RI band that may well be watching, are they getting a new band room?
It's one of the planning conditions that we need to discharge. So if we put that loop in that requires the demolition of the band room, then absolutely there will be. We can't demolish it without having an alternative location for them. So yes, that is, we can't do that phase without that provision. So yes.
Neil?
Just an overarching point, because I do think it's a really good example of project management that we put together for the front of station to help de-risk what is a significant and very complex project for the council by effectively putting it into a phase approach, because there is so many interdependencies of people making decisions on the next phase and the phase thereafter. It does mean that there is opportunities for, if relationships break down, if funding becomes an issue, that actually you can move forward, but with a known risk. You're completing phase 1, and then you can make another decision. Do you move on to phase 2? When you know the risks of entering to phase 2, we're continually looking at the level of commitment that we ask executive and members to make, because clearly on a big complex project like that, you can make a decision day 1, 5-10 years it rolls down the line and it becomes really, really difficult to retract where if you've got a phase, if you can, and in some projects you can, if you can phase it, then a phased approach does work well. And the same at the rear estate in York Central, the reason that we're not delivering it, but the reason we put that into the, I think it was 9 infrastructure delivery packages with the main road, the station, the museum square, the parking. So the reason we split it into those phases was recognising that it's much more robust as a project management perspective in the public sector to not just go all in.
Councillor Norman, then we'll wrap this item up, I think.
Yeah, apologies, and thank you for the explanation, which is very thorough as always. And if I've understood you correctly, both of you, I think this is potentially more something for executive to note in September than it is a question specifically for you. But it does strike me as if we have come up with a very comprehensive, well thought through plan for transport around the station, which clearly transport is the primary function and role of any station, particularly one as large as ours. And now, subsequently, after the fact, something has arisen, as they do, that fundamentally could alter how people are transported in and out of that setting. So whilst I understand, and I completely appreciate that separating it out into projects has mitigated that potential risk, there is still a significant risk to that overall strategy, isn't there, of coming up with a transport plan that holistically looks at and sorts transport. Like, you know, if we double the number of parking spaces on York Centre, on outside the station, that is going to have a massive knock-on effect on bus delivery, delivery of a huge number of other projects, probably even the van route, within that space. So yeah, clearly that balance is really important. The executive is going to have to think very thoroughly if any proposal comes back that is a dramatic change from what has already been suggested. Not that it might not, obviously it might not be, but yeah.
Thoroughly accurate analysis, Councillor.
Thank you very much. Okay, if members are content for us to move on to the next item. Thank you to James and Neil and Tracy for your time and engaging with us this evening. Are you going to hang around for the next one, Tracy? Thank you. So, agenda item 5, ethical asset disposal. So this is I'll talk to this. So back in September 2020, at a CSMC call-in meeting, it was resolved that a request be made for an appropriate scrutiny committee to undertake scoping work with a view to developing a strategy for the council on ethical disposal of its assets. A working group was subsequently formed. We held a number of conversations with officers, and some of the information we gathered is contained in Appendix 1, which members will have seen. The report talks about paragraph 2 of Appendix 1. The working group has also gathered information on what other local authorities do. The eagle eyes will have spotted that doesn't get a mention anywhere in the report, and that's my fault. Only when reading back the published report, realised that the information on what other local authorities do hadn't been added to the report. So that's entirely my fault, for which I apologise. So I'll now talk about what I would have put in the report. There is some interesting case studies that kind of I've unearthed in terms of what some other local authorities do. None of it's particularly groundbreaking. The best example I could find was West Lancashire Borough Council looked at all of its land and property holdings on a ward by ward basis. Any proposed changes in the use or potential disposals of the assets identified were discussed with the ward councillors, and the resultant recommendations reported to Cabinet or Executive in our case. So the approach that some local authorities take is a sort of proactive look at the assets that are within the council's ownership on a ward by ward basis, and having conversations with ward members. And that's something that I know in the context of the call-in that prompted the request was something that had been raised by some members. So that was an interesting example of a sort of proactive approach by one particular local authority. Other authorities produce, have a sort of a policy document on this one titled Policy on the Disposal of Surplus and Underused Land and Property Owned by the Council, the contents of which mirror what the City of York Council does in terms of each site is looked at on a case-by-case basis. Other potential uses will be considered. There'll be considerations to whether there can be a sort of transfer of the asset to a community group. There's consideration if the asset is listed as an asset of community value. All of the stuff that we would do in York, but it's in one place, which I thought was quite interesting. There's an organisation called the UK Green Building Council, which I don't know if any members or officers are familiar with, but that, certainly from the research I did, is as good a repository of examples of good practice around the country from some local authorities, some private or other public sector bodies. Some local authorities are members of the Green Building Council. It doesn't cost anything for local authorities, so it might be worth City of York Council joining that, because it's, again, some of it will be things we will be aware of. It talks about the use of land covenants. It talks about calculating the monetized social value of certain aspects of a proposed scheme or disposal. So again, some of the things that, from speaking with officers, things we do consider, and I know Andy Laslett was sort of recognised as the person in that team through whom discussions will be held about potential alternative uses for council assets. So there are, and apologies again for not putting this in the report, there are some things out there that I think it will be worth the council having a look at. But I would be, obviously, from the perspective of this committee, obviously this doesn't put forward any recommendations or next steps. It simply reports back on information we have gathered. So I would welcome comments or observations from members on what we've got thus far. Anybody? Councillor Baker.
Thank you. I just had a clarification question. At number 8, you're describing the social value policy, and it's helpful that you've included that. And I had a look through it, and I've looked at the social value policy many times, and I can't actually remember whether this is the one I'm familiar with or whether it has been reviewed. And as it says in number 8, the policy was subsequently adopted just in November 21. So is the one we've got in our pack here a reviewed one and an up-to-date one, because there's no date on it, or is it still subject to review?
So the version I included is the reviewed, updated policy, but yet that there isn't a date on it, so that should have been made clearer.
Okay.
With quite a few of the sort of policy documents that we had a look at, some of them were related to, but to in some cases to a greater extent than others, to the issue what we were actually looking at here, which was asset disposal. There's a lot on procurement, but less in terms of actual policy document you can point to and say that that is our documented approach to asset disposal. That there was less of that, which was, you know, from so personally that if we're doing further work, I think there is scope to look at actually formulating some recommendations, but that's just my sort of personal observations of what we've seen thus far. I don't know if Tracy, you want to comment on stuff we've done sort of thus far and stuff we could usefully do more of.
I suppose my position on this throughout the scrutiny process has been that you need to be careful not to mandate a single approach to decisions which can be radically different in nature depending on the asset and the potential future uses. So having an approach where on a case-by-case basis we can get agreement through executive on the priorities for disposal before any disposal takes place, and then have a methodology for trying to evaluate financial and non-financial measures, and that's always very difficult. And whichever methodology you might use to monetize social value, there's going to inherently be weaknesses in it, and it's a bit of a, you know, you pays your money, you takes your chances about how some of those things work out. And having tried to do this on a number of occasions, being really careful not to have unintended consequences from applying that kind of regime to a disposal decision where you come out, you know, you crank the handle on the methodology and the answer that comes out pleases no one. So what we've tried to do with disposal decisions is to set out the breadth and the complexity of those debates so that the members get to make that decision, and it's not computer says no type decision making. I think it's probably quite clear from the variety of different policies that you've drawn together from your scrutiny that it could do with a bit of a tidy up, so that it's clear how that relates to those property disposal decisions. But even getting to the point of identifying that an asset is surplus to requirements and no future use, there's a lot of decision making takes place to get to that point. So I don't think it's something that lends itself desperately well to a heavily proceduralized and formulaic approach, because there's a lot in the balance.
Yeah, and I agree. I think there's I think transparency is important, and I think that shouldn't be that shouldn't preclude that kind of case by case and responsive approach. And I think there is potentially more we could do on that front. Neil, you're saying?
Sort of epitomises the complexities of your role as members. I suppose there is the opportunity cost of the money as well. So effectively you sell a particular asset in a particular location, it might have a social use and a social value at that particular point in time and location. But the question you'll have to consider as members is, well, so does the money. So that money, if it's sold at a premium at that particular location, could you do more good with that money elsewhere? So it's just, again, it's just that function of thinking it's not just about the asset and the site in front of you, it's about the alternative use of the funds as well. I know it adds complexity, and I know there's constraints on the capital programme. You can't use capital receipts to effectively invest in revenue schemes, but you can use them to invest in capital schemes. It might be that you've got a bigger, more complex capital scheme somewhere else that actually selling off smaller assets or one other big asset that might have a social value, but actually your priority is scheme A. So again, it's just recognising the boundaries of the decision might be different for different sites and different opportunities. But sorry to add that complexity.
No.
It's in there.
Councillor Corbett.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks, Neil. I think the point of an ethical policy really is to be able to sort of guide you in that money versus morality type debate that you might be having with particular asset transfers. If I remember rightly, and it was a long time ago, it was pre-COVID, so that was about 50 years ago, it feels. This arose because there were concerns around the purchaser of an asset, and there were some questions raised around whether or not that was a suitable organisation to be buying that asset. And so I thought that what we were looking for was some sort of guidance around that. So, you know, it could be things like, does the purchaser subscribe to the Good Work programme or any of that kind of stuff? Are they ethical in their employment practices? Do they take care of their clients properly? If they have been prosecuted by the police for actions that they've taken or not taken? So those kind of things, I think, were the things that we were looking to include in an ethical policy.
Neil? I'm going to ask a question of Jane here. Sort of our best value for money, can we actually constrain in terms of to whom we sell? We can't do them sort of like an ethical vetting.
No, because the best value is for the best price. Oh, sorry, the best value is for the best price rather than putting conditions on it. So no, I don't think we can.
Well, you can apply different criteria of what you want. If you treat it as a compliant procurement and are clear about what your criteria for evaluation is up front, you can apply that. But I don't think there's any way where you can make a judgment on the suitability of a purchaser based on your view of their ethical stances. I think that's where it kind of crosses over the line. Certainly that's inherent in the procurement policy, and I think it's the same determination of the legal constraints that influences the disposal policy as well. You've got to determine outcomes rather than a judgment about the company.
So you could constrain the use of the site, I think is what you're saying, but you can't say, well, Mr. A or Mrs. B, we don't like your ethical view of the world. I think unless they were actually prohibited by national legislation as a terrorism organisation or something.
So as an example, you could award points in an evaluation matrix if a company had signed up to the Good Business Guide or applied the living wage, but you couldn't exclude them from it, and that would still be balanced against other things that you had to award points on evenly. So there's ways of weighting it that are legal, but an absolute, value judgment that can't be evidenced is highly, highly questionable and quite dangerous.
Councillor Kilburn and Councillor Norton.
So, for example, if you had a potential purchaser of a site that had criminal convictions for malpractice in that business, you wouldn't be able to use that as a reason not to sell the site to them.
Depends if it's one of those.
I think that's really difficult to answer, because you have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. So that if you're selling to a company, how would you know? Because there's difference between an individual entity and a corporate entity, and it's also how the bid is submitted, etc. So you can't really go off information that you become aware of. You have to stick very, very closely to the procurement framework or specification or criteria that Tracy's just outlined, and you have to look at who is it that's bidding for it. You can't just go off information that you may know about one person, for example, but you have to do on a case-by-case basis, because it's very much individual purchaser versus corporate entity purchaser versus a conglomerate purchaser, etc.
And there's a whole raft of legislation that we're not going to quote off the top of our heads as to what people, when a criminal conviction is discharged, when you can take it into consideration, when you can't, what the nature of the work you're actually doing. So it becomes it's a minefield to start prescribing.
Chair, so we have policies on climate change. If a company was trying to buy something from us that egregiously didn't follow climate change policies, we couldn't then not sell to that company?
It comes down to the what are you selling the land for? So if you're selling the land, and as Tracy's outlined, you've got a criteria, they meet all the criteria, despite the fact that they might be, I don't know, it depends on your view of the world. BP, Exxon, whomever, you couldn't say that they couldn't tender or participate in that affair. Just equally, you couldn't say, oh, company X, Y, or Z. It's the actual exercise that you're taking in front of you. You're not taking a judgment call on the participants in there. You're not making that ethical judgment of who can't. participate.
Councillor Kildane, do you have questions?
I assume that was the entire purpose of an ethical asset disposal policy, was to provide that level of guidance. You know, it is something that we do on a regular, you know, for example, we won't send any of our plastic recycling overseas, which means that we can't recycle all kinds of different types of plastic because they're not recycled in the UK. So we have those sort of ethical policies in place that govern our purchasing or disposal decisions. I thought the aim of this task group was to look at developing that kind of policy for exactly these kind of situations that you're describing, where these complexities arise.
So I think we were well, what we tried to do was establish what we've currently got in terms of, and we didn't look at what we would legally be allowed to do. It's a legitimate question, and from the discussion we had, it was probably helpful certainly for me to better understand, you know, when we're going down the track of looking to dispose of an asset, or what are the factors that you can consider and not consider in terms of potentially excluding sort of potential buyers. It's a fair question. Before I let Neil come in, Councillor Norman's been waiting.
Yeah, I have a broader point, but just quickly, I'm sorry, I have a broader point, but just quickly on this specifically as well, because I think the officer we spoke to is not present, if my memory is serves me, although it was a while ago. I think we did also have some discussion with the working group about this specific example. And I think the view of officers was that there had been a process that they thought had done a fair bit of diligence on this. And I think it would be fair to note that in this specific case, that was the view of officers involved in that procurement. But
I think we just need to separate the asset from the purchaser. So you can prescribe, as executive have done on the Piccadilly disposal, as to the function, the governance effectively that you're going to place on it, the exercise that you go through. So you can absolutely, from an ethical perspective, say we want to dispose of this land, and that's what you're doing for this purpose. There's the opportunity to do that, but you're not undertaking a sort of judgment call on the economic entity behind it, other than.
Although there are things that you could do by specifying to constrain the predictable excesses that might come to the table. Like, so I'm using that as an example. 17 to 21 will be disposed of for affordable housing to a registered provider, and we're insisting on that being a licensed registered provider, so that you've got some benchmark of quality on the provision of those services once it's disposed of, and doing whatever you can through sale documents and leases to be able to make sure that stays in perpetuity, or as near as you can get to that. But property law was not designed to do this, and there are limits to what it can do. And I think once it gets into individual criminality, it becomes incredibly difficult to apply. But I think that you're absolutely right, that the purpose of an ethical policy for this is to give officers guidance when they are trying to make those balances, so that they understand what are the priorities of the existing executive to be able to apply those, and what balance are they seeking to make between financial return, social good, and a lack of social bad, because those are the three things that you're trying to weigh up in that, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really helpful way of understanding it. So I think there is a bit more work we could do in terms of trying to sort of pull together some of the things we found, add in examples from elsewhere, with view to coming up with, it's that having that kind of framework with some of the sort of constraints and opportunities that we've discussed. I think there is. It's a start, but I would like to continue, if members of the working group would be happy to continue, and well, with the support of officers who've been sort of, helpful in helping us understand. But we're coming at it from as not a subject matter expert, so it's been helpful to get that support. Councillor Norman.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention this sort of quasi-officially that Johnny Hayes, who spoke in public speaking, has passed us a number of case studies of cases where he thinks that those assets were not disposed of perhaps in the best way. And whilst I think, we could spend some time here today talking through them, I'm sure that's potentially not the best spend of our time. And maybe one thing that the working group could do as we go through, I think those case studies of potentially how things have maybe not gone as well in the past are quite good for us to understand how going forwards, what kind of those directions could take on. So perhaps that could be something that if we were going to talk in the future, we could talk.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to understand people's perspectives as to why outcomes were not as they may have wished, but that's not to say that there was anything intrinsically flawed in obviously, but we can discuss those in detail and see if things could be good. I'm sure things could always be done differently, but whether there's any sort of emerging sort of common themes from. I did have a brief look at it, but I didn't have a chance to read it in detail.
And we're happy to discuss any previous decisions and understanding the rationale at the time, which of course for 2020 vision may differ. But if there's one thing I've learned about this part of my portfolio is that I will never do anything that everybody agrees with it. And for every 10 people who might think that was right, there'll be 10 that think it was wrong.
Thanks, Chair. So just to get back to the ethical disposal policy, is this then something that needs to go for further scrutiny task review?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't think we're at the point where we would come here and say we have a sort of full understanding of the issue, and City of York Council, in terms of what I've seen that other local authorities do, I think there are some things that we could do, and Tracy mentioned sort of, perhaps bringing things together in one place so that we have a better understanding of where there are potentially areas for improvement in how we describe what we do, and setting out the opportunities and the constraints that might exist. So I think if members are content for the current working group to continue to work on this with support of officers, and then if some of us drop out, others can no doubt be brought in, depending on what committees we're all on in 3 days' time. Does that sound okay? Okay. Thank you very much. Brings us on to agenda item 6, the intriguingly titled Developing Scrutiny Members.
Absolutely. So this has been a sort of a topic that has been discussed at numerous times with the chair of CCSMC, and we have tried, as the report says, we've tried to contact the Centre for Governance and Public Scrutiny, which is formerly the Centre for Public Scrutiny, to try and gain some momentum from them about assisting us in helping design training, but unfortunately they're not able to help just as yet. And previous contacts with the LGA, as the report indicates, have been slightly frustrated due to the pandemic and availability of limited resource at the LGA. However, during this time as well, the Audit and Governance Committee, as it says, has now picked up the arrangements and looking at member development for the forthcoming elections in May 2023, and it's part of our action plan towards embedding good governance. So the chair of CCSMC is aware of that, and there were conversations, I understand, with the chair of A&G and the chair of this committee as well about some collaborative conversations of sharing experiences, thoughts, views, etc. So the planning for and delivery of scrutiny training aiming towards May 2023 is currently being looked at by myself and Dawn, who is the statutory scrutiny officer, and we are liaising with the Audit and Governance Committee as well. The aim is, for those members who are already on A&G at this moment are aware, is that the current work plan for A&G is that hopefully we can sign off the member development framework and programme by December of this year. I'm afraid I haven't got any more update. The report written by Dawn is quite self-explanatory, really, of the frustrations that we've experienced and also some of the topics. It is annual council, as you say, in 3 days' time, and so we cannot absolutely review the training, the immediate training that's required for scrutiny members and following annual council as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think in an environment where scrutiny members are expected and required to do more of the spade work, I think the more support and guidance that members can have, so we can actually do, you know, good quality work, I think is really important, rather than just be sort of passive observers to the scrutiny process, which isn't much fun for anyone. So the options here are to note the role of audit and governance and to consider whether we wish to be kept informed on any decisions made relating to training and induction. I personally think it would be entirely appropriate for this committee, given its oversight of the wider scrutiny function, to be informed and involved wherever possible, so that our views can be taken into account. Would anyone like to say anything about this? Councillor Baker.
Thanks. Just a quick comment. At number 5, it says both joint standards and audit and governance have concerned themselves with training and developing elected members. So I just thought it'd be worth noting, as a member of Joint Standards Committee, and the joint bit is because we're joint with parish councillors, our members on the committee are quite keen to show any possible extension of support to parish councils throughout this process, and more we're seeing parish councils under strain and facing difficulties with recruitment and retention of members and internal struggles. So I just thought it would be worth saying that anything we can do to support parish councils and offer training or share costs would be worthwhile. And I know Janie is well up on all of that.
Yes, we're currently working with the Yorkshire Local Councils Association, who have an extensive training programme. It's just not actively taken up. But our primary concern of working with the parish councils is the adoption of the model code, which this council adopted as the principal council in October 2021. I've got a meeting with the Yorkshire Local Councils Association this week, actually, to look at that, because as the Vice Chair of Joint Standards Committee reported to that committee on the last occasion, there was some confusion in the email that was circulated to parish council clerks about the model code, and the impression was given that it was a draft code. So we're just working with Yorkshire Local Councils Association to try and encourage, and that is a real starting point, really, of the Joint Standards Committee offering their support to parish councils to just try and encourage the importance of it. As Councillor Baker says, there has been lots of problems with some parish councils at the moment around governance, and the Joint Standards Committee is trying to encourage parish councillors to take up the quite wide-ranging suite of training that is offered by YLCA.
Sounds good. Councillor Rowley.
Again, thank you, Rose, for bringing that up. But again, just for clarity, there is one parish council that's not a member of YLCA.
But they do receive the information. So
they do, but
they do receive the information.
They wouldn't have access to that training.
But that is a decision for them, because there is a fee to join the YLCA. So that particular council has chosen not to spend the fee.
Okay. Councillor Kilbane.
Can I just, do we have any dedicated full-time trained scrutiny officers at the council anymore?
We don't at the moment, but that is an issue that myself and Dawn are looking into, and we have liaised with the Chair of Corporate Scrutiny.
Thank you. Any further questions? No? Okay, thank you, Janie and Dawn. Agenda item 7, work plan. Page 125, which, as you'll see, is just a list of forum meeting dates. Just say the HDS, Housing and Community Safety Scrutiny meeting forum is now going to be on the 30th of June, not the 15th, because there's a clash with a local plan working group. That's right. So that date's changed, and obviously the outputs of those forum meetings will inform the work plan for the rest of the year. No comments on the work plan?
So Chair, can I just comment that obviously we've got annual council in 3 days, time.
Sorry, Councillor Orrell, just rejoin us, please.
So Chair, just to clarify, we do have annual council in 3 days' time, conscious that membership of committees may be subject to change as well. So obviously the first forum meetings for all the scrutiny committees are looking at developing work plans for the forthcoming year, and so that myself and Dawn will be in contact with chairs and vice chairs once appointed, as well as chair and vice chair of this committee as well, to make sure that members feel supported to go into those meetings for work planning, because it is the first of the new municipal year.
Thank you. Okay. That's all on work plan. Urgent business, I've not been notified of any. So thank you, members, for your attendance, and I wish you good night.